Hey guys, welcome back to another one of my Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. rewatch series videos. Now I've decided to change the titles and the names of these videos to Rediscovering S.H.I.E.L.D. because seriously, watching these old episodes, I'm rediscovering a lot about them. A lot of amazing stuff as well. Like for example, I'm past watching episode 9, and surprisingly, there's a lot that we didn't notice the first time around that we watched them. But enough of that though, because you're gonna realize what I'm talking about over here when we get to talking episodes like episode 9. And for the time being, let's talk about episodes 5 through 7, the title of this video, starting with episode 5, which was otherwise titled The Girl in the Flower Dress. Now, Girl in the Flower Dress, the title of the episode, was of course a reference to Raina, one of the villains of the episode, but also seemed to be a play on the titles of the movie franchise that includes The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. But right off the bat though, on this episode, the index is mentioned, and the index is the list that S.H.I.E.L.D. keeps on objects and people with powers. Now that felt a lot similar in nature to both the Superhero Registration Act from the comics, one that would be later on introduced into the Marvel Cinematic Universe on Captain America Civil War through the Sokovia Accords. But circling back to Raina though, she gave Chan the name Scorch. Now I'm assuming over here that Scorch in the comics is basically Tommy Ng, considering his powers and his villainy of course. Still on Raina though, as she gives us the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe reference on this episode.
Have you ever heard of Steve Rogers? No. But Captain America, now he's on the news. And a lunchbox. And a poster on the wall.
Now the next two are not really Easter eggs. One is a pop culture reference and the other one is a reference to real life events. So we've got Miles, friends with Daisy, and Hacker Extraordinaire within the Rising Tide, introduced on this episode, and for the purpose of this episode only actually, seemed to play a lot of Minecraft, which was really popular at the time. I think it was one of the most played games in 2013, and most popular as well. And 2013 is the year of release of the first season of the series. But in terms of real-life events, he also mentioned Snowden and Manning, in reference to Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. But the last of the Easter eggs on this episode before we talk trivia and then foreshadowing is one that Coulson basically pointed us towards. Love these things. And in this case, the thing is the same item that he used on Iron Man to bypass the keycard locked door, just like he does on this episode. But as I just mentioned, the final two over here happen to be trivia bits, the first of which is about Raina, who just like Fitz and Simmons, and as I mentioned on my first video, ended up becoming part of the 616 continuity in 2015. The other one though is all part of the drive that Skye presents Coulson at the end of the episode. Now this drive contained data that she has managed over the years to gather on herself in order to find her parents in her quest to do so. Now as Coulson checks out the contents of this drive, we see a document bearing the header St. Agnes Orphanage. And it was less than 2 years later that we discovered that another one of our Marvel television superheroes was placed there, Matt Murdock. But finally though, and before I move on to episode 6, there were 3 bits of foreshadowing on this episode. There was number 1, May referring to the old days with a smile on her face as well. Now that hinted towards her and Coulson having history, a history of friendship, and possibly more. Once again, it's more of foreshadowing on season 1 that kinda comes to fruition on both seasons 4 and 5. But number 2, Skye tells Coulson all about her big secret, her attempts at trying to figure out who her parents are, which is basically all about foreshadowing the Daisy destiny, the fact she would become Quake, and of course the entire storyline of season 2 of the series. I did tell you guys on my first and second videos, watching all of this once again makes it feel that these guys had most of it planned. But finally though, number 3, the Clairvoyant, that's the first mention of the major villain of the season. That major villain is the man we would discover later on is John Garrett, the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, friend of Coulson's, turned Hydra leader. That being said though, let's move on to episode 6 of the first season, otherwise titled FZZT. So at the very beginning of the episode, the index is referenced once again, both foreshadowing what would later happen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in general, with the Superhuman Registration Act and whatnot, and on the series in a more specific light with the Inhuman Registration Act. But there's Daisy's statement and the explanation that follows.
FZZT teacher at the local high school, and varsity baseball coach, and troop leader, and volunteer firefighter. This guy makes Captain America look like the dude. The big Lebowski. Seriously?
But moving on, we've got our usual reference to the Avengers movie, because the victims on this episode happen to be all part of a volunteer firefighter team sent to New York after the Chitauri invasion. But that's not really the only reference to the Avengers over here, because the culprit on this episode and the source of the alien virus that infects all of them and also infects Simmons later on happens to be a Chitauri helmet. But by my count, so far we've got 2 Marvel Cinematic Universe, Greater Marvel Cinematic Universe cameos and guest stars. We've got Maria Hill on the premiere, and we've got Nick Fury on the second episode. And on this episode, the series added Felix Blake. Now his appearance is not just a crossover with the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not just a guest starring gig, but also a reference to the Marvel one-shot, Item 47. Now do remember, the main premise of the one-shot was all about this random couple finding a Chitauri gun, another Chitauri object. But moving on, sometimes the use of the simplest words, simplest names feels too far from being an Easter egg or a reference, but you still can't pass on hearing the words Typhoid Mary, and that gets harder when you now know that she would feature on the second season of Iron Fist later on. So I'm thinking over here, the use of Typhoid Mary in any context could be a reference to the Daredevil villain out of the comics. In terms of Easter eggs and references though, we have this last one for this episode, which is basically Coulson's, but don't worry, you don't have to start calling me Iron Man. That's of course a reference to the character and the interactions that Coulson has had with him over the course of 3 movies. But foreshadowing time! Number 1, Daisy talking about this powerful link between Fitz and Simmons that just hinted towards the relationship that these two would have down the road, even though at the time Fitz had a big crush on Daisy. Number 2, Fitz sacrificing and running into the lab with an infected Jemma. Just try to keep your hands off me, will ya? And I'm doing what we always do. We're gonna fix this together. All again foreshadowing of Fitz Simmons. Number 3, Coulson talking about his death, how it felt like it was more than 8 seconds. How he feels like something is missing, like they didn't tell him the full truth. That along with him talking about his ordering his own tests feeling different. Once again, and as is the case with so many episodes from the beginning of the season, they're all foreshadowing the reveal later on. But finally, number 4, May asking the incomplete question of, you know how long it has taken me? That's yet another reminder the series knew what it was going for, and that's basically a full-blown reveal of what happened in Bahrain with May. Now this video is going to take a little bit over those 8 to 12 minutes that I promised for this series of videos, but nonetheless, let's move faster and into episode 7, otherwise titled The Hub. Now let's start with a little bit of trivia. On this episode we meet Agent Shaw, and on season 5 we meet Deke Shaw. Now this episode was the source of that theory that some of us had later on, that Deke was basically the descendant of Agent Shaw. It is still a possibility, by the way, even though very far-fetched, because we don't know who his father descended from. But speaking of Agent Shaw, losing yourself undercover in a way, willing to do whatever it takes, doing things that you would never otherwise do, all felt very so many movies out there. Out of all of those, my favorite, I suppose, would be Donnie Brasco. But I'm afraid this mission is classified Level 8. Now Coulson here goes to remind us that S.H.I.E.L.D. is layered and leveled. 10 is the highest level, one that in the comics included Nick Fury, Black Widow, and not surprisingly, Daisy Johnson. Now Coulson on the series as well is level 8, while in the comics he's introduced in 2012 as level 9. But anyway though, and on this episode we get to visit the S.H.I.E.L.D. base known as the Hub, and there is nothing in the comics about any hub except for a mutant with the same name. But Jemma though does reference the Triskelion, the S.H.I.E.L.D. base from both the comics, and one that would not too long after the airing of this episode be introduced in the Marvel Cinematic Universe on Captain America the Winter Soldier. So you could count this one as both an Easter egg and a bit of foreshadowing. But as the team enters the hub, we get 3 references right away on that big screen they walk by. The first one is to Euromind, an acronym for European Monitoring, Investigation and Enforcement Division. Obviously, and from the name, it is a subdivision of S.H.I.E.L.D. But the second reference on that screen though is to the Alternate Reality Monitoring and Operational Response Agency, ARMOR. Now, ARMOR in the comics was established in order to combat interdimensional threats. So, there is the possibility, and once we find out more about Season 6 of the series, that they've already foreshadowed since Season 1 interdimensional threats, as in other realities. Finally though, there was Hammer, but this was not just referenced the one time on this episode, but rather another time, like moments later. Now as the team walks through the hub, we see a sign that reads Hammer, and Hammer is a reference to the organization that replaced S.H.I.E.L.D. after it was infiltrated by the Skrulls on the pages of the comics. Now you would think this would be a reference to both the Skrull invasion and to Hammer, which is a double reference, but it's even better, a triple reference, because in this episode we do meet Victoria Hand. Now, Victoria Hand, on the pages of the comics, worked with Hammer under the leadership of Norman Osborn, who we also know as the Green Goblin. But on the subject of people that we meet on this episode, we meet Jasper Sitwell. At this point in the lifetime of the series, Sitwell would count as the 4th crossover character from the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. But Jasper Sitwell is also a character right out of the comic books. The story for the character has been changed significantly for the purpose of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but that doesn't change the fact that he's one of those characters on the series that are right out of the comic books. But a little bit of trivia: Hand, who would be killed later on in the events of this season, happens to have been introduced on the pages of Iron Man in the comics, and happens to have died on the pages of the comics as well at the hands of Daniel Drum in 2013, the very same year that this series got greenlit and ended up airing its premiere. But still on Victoria Hand, Barton, Romanov, they never have an extraction plan. Her words over here happen to be our almost regular mention of the Avengers or the Chitauri invasion on almost every single episode of Season 1. But moving on though to Grant Ward as fighting the Separatists with those chains on this episode, that felt very Ghost Rider. I'm not saying that was foreshadowing that we're gonna get the Ghost Rider, but nonetheless, we did get the Ghost Rider a little bit under 3 years later. Still on Ward, it's the Extraction team. Better, it's the Cavalry. That was another reference to that name that May rejected on the 2nd episode of this season, and an explanation of what it means to be the Cavalry. Also, let's not forget the foreshadowing. But finally on the list of Easter eggs and references, Skye referring to Coulson as a robot version of himself, that felt a little bit like a reference to the life model decoys, LMDs from the comics, something that once again, less than 3 years later down the road, we watch on the events of the series. But let us quickly go through all the foreshadowing on this episode before we get to end this video. So number 1, once again, Jemma worrying about Fitz as he goes behind enemy lines on this episode, preparing that sandwich for him. That was once again another moment in the earlier episodes of the series to foreshadow the destiny of Fitz Simmons. Number 2, Skye once again wants to try to figure out all about the redacted file on her parents, another moment of foreshadowing towards Skye being Daisy Johnson. Number 3, Skye becoming less of the self-centered person that she's been throughout the first few episodes, trying to figure out what's going on with the guys instead of cracking her own lineage file. That was basically another bit of foreshadowing towards her becoming the superhero, towards her becoming Daisy Johnson. Number 4, the way that Coulson talks about the magic of Tahiti is starting to fade away. 5 seasons in, and after understanding all that happened to Coulson in order to get back to life, you would realize that at that point they were not just foreshadowing that he died for more than 8 seconds, but rather that the Tahiti thing, the entire thing, was just a fake.
I only know what I've read. Seems Fury has a soft spot for his favorites. Not everyone gets sent to Tahiti.
It's a magical place.
Number 5, in the stinger of this episode, Coulson realizing he's got no access to his very own recovery file. That, in my opinion, was just the final bit of foreshadowing to make us realize that something is not right about this entire Tahiti talk. But finally though, number 6, I'm not really sure that this one was intentional on this episode, but Coulson's managing to extract his guys made Victoria Hand seem pretty happy. The one that was not happy on this episode about it all was Jasper Sitwell. Now I'm assuming, and this is just assumption over here, that with the greater and stronger connectivity to the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, back when Season 1 was airing, there's a good chance that this was foreshadowing that Sitwell is Hydra, something that we would later on discover on the events of Winter Soldier. You do need to remember here as well that no matter how much they foreshadowed it back then, we would have never noticed it, because simply put, and so far in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and of course all the way on the pages of the comics, Jasper Sitwell has always been a loyal agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. But that being said though, my work here is done. Sorry for prolonging this video, but this is the material I've got out of these episodes, so you can let me know in the comments if you're doing a rewatch of these episodes. You can let me know as well if you did catch any Easter eggs that I did not mention on this video. Let me know as well if you did like this video by dropping it a much appreciated like, subscribing to this channel, and enabling notifications for my future videos, community posts, and live streams. And until the next time you tune in for another one of my videos, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or otherwise, thank you so much for tuning into this one, and have a great day.